When I was a little girl, I always thought I would grow up to be a doctor. And one of my favorite books to read was called The Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Encyclopedia. It was a very thick book that came free with a set of encyclopedias, which I know a lot of you don't know anymore because we have Wikipedia, but we used to have encyclopedia books. And every day after I came home from school, I would flip randomly to a page and read about the strangest things about the human body that fascinated me. And the walls of my room were decorated with my childish illustration of bones, names like scapula and fibula sounding so very exotic. And I even had a model skull with a brain that I called Yorick, thanks to Hamlet. And Yorick was my steadfast companion through all the angst of my teenage years. So it sounded like I was this really stereotypical student who was going to end up in medical school. And when I finished my SPM in 2001, I applied to University Malaya at Pusat Asasi Science, the next step in my journey to becoming a doctor, or so I thought. You see, my mother, unlike most Asian parents, did not think I would make a very good doctor. But I told her, I want to help people, I said. And she said, well, there are many other ways of helping people, and you would make a terrible doctor because you're more fascinated with the facts than with the person, and your bedside manners would be atrocious. She didn't stop there. She dragged me to meet doctors in hospital to describe their studies and work, and she told me to study different pathways related to medicine. Maybe you can invent the next life-saving drug instead of being a doctor. Think outside the box. Stop following everybody else, she would say. And just for a tip for some of you, because I know a few deans of medical schools now, if they interview you and ask you why you want to become a doctor, don't say that you want to help people, because they'll just tell you to go to nursing school instead. Think of another answer. Anyway, this phrase, stop following everybody else, was a favorite of my mother's. And as we all know, we should always listen to our mothers. As it turns out, I realized that medical school would mean three things to me. One, endless memorization of terms, diseases, and symptoms. Two, it would also mean a very step-by-step career progression, restricted by hierarchy and tenure. And three, I would be dealing every day with cranky, ill people. And even as a child, I realized that I was not the most particularly patient person. And medical school seemed just like a bad combination of all the things that I would hate. Anyway, I knew I loved biology and chemistry. Physics, not so much, though I'd come to love that too later in life. So I ended up at Harvard to study biochemistry. There are many things that one imagines about Harvard. Lots of rich kids, history and tradition, brilliant professors and classmates. As it turns out, I never imagined that what Harvard would do was turn me off a career in biochemistry. But it did, because I realized that rather than spending most of my days alone in labs researching a molecule, which I did, studying rotavirus, I rather enjoyed dealing with people instead, learning new things, which I never had a chance to do at home. I took classes in history of art and architecture, theory of music, Soviet history and communism, and even went to Latin America to study hallucinogenic plants and shamanism. Until today, I'm forever grateful that Harvard's liberal arts curriculum allowed me to see beyond the boundaries I had set for myself, that allowed me to fully develop into the person that I would become. When I came back to Malaysia, I worked for a while as a management consultant with the Boston Consulting Group. Great 5-figure pay as a starting job. Lots of travel and air miles and hotel points and expense accounts. But after 2 years, I knew this wasn't what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I knew I didn't want to be a management consultant forever. But I also didn't know what is it I actually wanted to do, which is kind of common for people, so don't worry if you're facing it. So what do you do when you get this kind of mid-20 life crisis nowadays? You do an advanced degree. Now, everyone these days chooses to do an MBA because it's an obvious step up the corporate ladder. But stop following everybody else. I can hear my mom yelling in my head even now. And so, returning back to my passion for medicine, I decided to do a master's in public health. And I figured since Malaysians were getting obese the fastest in Asia, this was probably a good area for me to get into for the long term. And public health is also a study in public policy, a macro view that has been lacking before. Plus, I managed to get Maxis to pay for my scholarship to go to London. So I thought some time off in London would be good, and so off I went. And when I came back, I looked around and decided that given my interest, I should probably join the healthcare industry. And I never looked back because healthcare is a fascinating industry. For most people, their only exposure to the healthcare industry is the service providers, the doctors, the nurses, the pharmacists, maybe the radiographers and the rehab therapists. But healthcare is so much more than just medicine. Medicine and health is, of course, the reason customers and patients come to clinics and hospitals. But when I started working in healthcare, I realized it was so much more than that. And that in avoiding medical school, I managed to cultivate perspectives that allowed me to appreciate that fact. So, what is healthcare? The simplest part for people to understand is that healthcare is a service. But it's also reliant on people to provide care. And it's an industry that is not very easily automated. Every day, we need at least 3 nurses to serve each patient because nursing care has to be provided 24/7. And nursing care doesn't mean sponge baths or serving meals. Nurses are the frontliners who provide information to doctors on patients' input or output. They chart observations and are there to pick up the warning signs to alert the doctors. They provide counseling to patients. They have to ensure that the patient information is correctly handed over to various departments from lab to x-ray and pharmacy. And they have to know every single piece of equipment in the OT, the operating theater, in order to assist the hundreds of different kinds of surgeries that happen at any time, when a doctor may only need to know what he or she uses for his specialty. So the next time when you see a poor tired nurse who doesn't answer your request for hot water as prompt as you would like, take a step back and see beyond our prejudice of what we assume nurses are doing. It's not Florence Nightingale anymore. Healthcare is a service that is unpredictable and not easy to standardize simply because customers' needs and wants are uniquely individual depending on their clinical history, physical anatomy and physiology, and thousands of other factors that could decide whether a patient undergoes treatment A or B and how they would react and recover. It's also a service that runs 24/7, 365 days a week, where demand is unpredictable simply because the service is only sought and consumed when needed. It's a service that's also highly reliant on facilities and infrastructure. If one needs an open heart surgery, one needs a heart-lung machine and a major OT, preferably sooner rather than later. In fact, just a few hours ago, I received a message from a hospital saying that they had an issue with the heart-lung machine and the patient was on the table. And everybody had to come back to the hospital. Somebody had to go and find out what was wrong and go and fix it. And thankfully, everything was okay. But it just kind of illustrates that not only do we need the best professional staff, we also need people like technicians, engineers, and support staff to make sure that this facility or plant is operating at optimum capacity all day, every day. Water cuts, power cuts, equipment malfunction, everything needs to be planned and prepared for because a disaster could have an impact on somebody's life. Healthcare is also a big business. However, unlike other businesses in Malaysia, like maybe banking or property, you don't really make a monstrous profit in a short period of time. But you can expect a steady return over a long period of time simply because healthcare is not really a cyclical industry and will continue to grow as long as we have a growing population. Healthcare is also a capital-intensive business. Unlike other service industries, healthcare requires massive upfront investment in property, plant, and machinery. Today, a linear accelerator, the standard equipment for radiosurgery for cancer, costs at least 20 million ringgit just for the equipment. It doesn't include the cost of constructing the bunkers, the associated equipment, the hiring of the professional staff, and others. So healthcare is an expensive business. Today, close to 70% of all medicines in Malaysia are fully imported. And in 2017, we Malaysians imported about 2 billion ringgit worth of medical equipment. As healthcare costs escalate around the world, Malaysia is not immune and is struggling with issues of healthcare access, affordability, and sustainability. Last but not least, healthcare is a social good. In Malaysia, the government is the biggest provider of healthcare, and we Malaysians can be thankful that as citizens, there is relatively affordable universal healthcare coverage. So what role do private sector players have? What is our role within a community? Because a healthcare business is not just a business. There is an innate ethical responsibility for healthcare providers, regardless of whether they're for profit or not, to preserve the sanctity of life. The Hippocratic Oath applies to all of us. So how then do we reconcile the need to be a good member of our communities, to return profits to shareholders who had invested massive amounts of capital upfront to build our hospitals, to provide excellent and safe service to our patients and customers, to treat our employees well and compensate them for the risk that they take every day to save patients' lives? What we need is people like you. Healthcare doesn't just need doctors and nurses. It needs professionals and experts from various disciplines. For example, the future of healthcare is moving towards personalized medicine. As geneticists are able to further interpret what our DNA tells us, there is a growing demand for treatments that target specific diseases caused by individual traits or mutations. On the 25th of May of this year, the US FDA approved for the drug company Novartis to sell a gene therapy named Zolgensma to treat severe spinal muscular dystrophy in children under 2. It costs $2.1 million for a single one-off dose. And treatments such as these could be the new normal. And it requires not just doctors, but also researchers from various fields, not just in biology, but also experts in advanced manufacturing, to be able to create and manufacture drugs like these that are unique but at scale. Healthcare is also moving towards decentralization. Today, patients demand that they receive care at their convenience. Advances in technology have enabled telemedicine and for the care to be rendered outside traditional hospitals and clinics. In March of this year, surgeons in China performed the country's first ever 5G remote brain surgery. Using 5G technology and robotic surgical instruments, a surgeon in Beijing conducted surgery on a patient in Hainan, 3,000 kilometers away, to implant a deep brain stimulation implant into the patient's brain that would help control his Parkinson's symptoms. This is obviously not just a triumph for the doctors, but also shows that engineers, telcos, and other experts we usually associate with Silicon Valley, they're becoming more and more important for the future of healthcare. Coming back down to something more familiar, let's talk about diabetes. Malaysia has the highest rate of diabetes in the world. 1 in every 4 Malaysians, either knowingly or unknowingly, is diabetic. And diabetes is what we call a non-communicable disease. A disease that is by and large caused by our lifestyle choices, from what we eat to how we come to this venue today. In my hospital, we treat a lot of infertility cases. The incidence of infertility is rising, not just due to demographic factors such as delayed marriage, but also due to lifestyle factors such as pollution, poor diet, stress, and others. And so healthcare is also about lifestyle. And we need people in healthcare who are experts in these things, from environmental pollution to social and behavioral science to urban planning. As my professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine once said, the car is the most efficient way of converting fossil fuel to fat. How we plan our cities in the future, the kind of education and diet we provide to children are all part of what we call social determinants of health. And research is being conducted right now all over the world to assess the impact of these social factors to our health. Last but not least, let's talk about money. Every country in the world right now is struggling with the issue of how to provide healthcare, often seen as a basic human right, to everyone at an affordable cost. And many solutions to this problem have been discussed, one of which is called value-based medicine. Value-based medicine is a concept that relates the value of the care given to the total outcome of the patient, not just recovery, but also opportunity costs, such as time taken off work and so forth. Healthcare providers will be compensated based on this figure, and improvements that are made to care, such as shortening length of stay, would benefit the provider rather than the current fee-for-service model where providers are incentivized to prolong stays. For this reason, even a low-cost company such as Walmart would actually fly its employees all the way to a top hospital like Mayo Clinic in Minnesota to seek treatment. Because even though the procedure itself may cost more, due to the faster recovery and lower complication rates, the total cost to the company is lower. And so healthcare needs experts in economics, data science, public policy, and others to come together to make this a viable solution. So I go back to the theme of our event today, which is Beyond Borders. The burdens faced by your generation, like affordable healthcare and climate change, may seem unsurmountable, but it requires each and every one of us to develop expertise in our chosen areas and to come together to draft a different version of our future. It requires us to envision what does not yet exist today so that we can work together towards building a better tomorrow. My time is passing. I'm no longer considered youth based on the law that was just passed. And so all I can advise you is to look beyond the box. This requires humility, to see what you don't expect, and to go down to the ground to experience what you would never experience in a normal course of your life. In my career in healthcare, I've had the opportunity to go to rural areas, to see for myself the conditions of care in countries like Bangladesh and Indonesia. And I would participate in stock takes over the weekend just to see how the staff deal with inventories and issues on the ground. Looking beyond the box also requires intellectual curiosity, a need to follow a thread of thought that may lead you to discover new areas. And even though I never had a medical degree or a business degree, but by learning different things, one can appreciate the complexities in the healthcare industry. And in my own way, I'm trying to lead Thomson to do healthcare better in a different way. We want to build not just hospitals and clinics, but an integrated health system. Because the health issue that we face today is no longer solved with just a dose of antibiotics. A lot of the diseases that we face are lifelong diseases, things like cancer, things like diabetes. And how do we actually help people live with a disease rather than just curing them? Last but not least, in the immortal words of my mom, for God's sakes, don't follow everybody else, because that path has already been trod and the world doesn't need more of the same. I wish you all the best, and thank you.